Hello.
How are you?
Okay. Zoom is so finicky.
Mm-hmm. All right. How are you doing, Cheryl?
Okay, go.
All right. Hello, welcome everyone to LGBTQA Advocacy. Today we're going to be speaking about how we can all be advocating more actively for LGBTQ clients in the work that we do. And this was created by myself, Beckett, Jenna Sarvis, and then also Natalia, who is not available to be on this call right now, but she put a lot of work into this as well. So the outline of what we'll be speaking about is we're going to talk about the LGBTQI community at large. We're going to speak about identity and what it means to be within the LGBTQ community. We're going to speak to barriers that this community faces, how COVID-19 has affected these barriers, and then some guidelines for making our work more inclusive. Specifically, we're going to be speaking about a few points, including the language we use, bathrooms, and how bathrooms can be kind of a complicated subject, but they don't necessarily need to be, signage in our offices, and just creating a more opening and a welcoming space, and then also the forms we use, and how forms can actually be used specifically to create a really welcoming environment for folks. So just to kind of get started, LGBTQ, who are we speaking about? So the LGBTQ community is a really loosely defined group of non-normative, quote unquote, sexualities and gender identities, organizations, subcultures, which are all united by common culture. And kind of, I made quotations, I'm sure you can see it when I said non-normative, because we'll kind of speak to that a little bit more, but there's this idea that LGBTQ folks are non-normative or outside of the norm, and that is based on our society and kind of how socially we view LGBTQ folks. So the LGBTQ community includes a lot of sexual orientations and gender identities that differ from what we think of as the norm. And we can see that there's a pretty, when we say LGBTQ, a lot of people call it like an alphabet soup and not really sure who we're speaking about. But just kind of knowing that LGBTQ is very expansive, and the plus really includes a lot of other gender identities, including indigenous identities such as two-spirit, non-binary folks, or folks who don't identify within the gender binary, people who identify outside of the gender binary at all, who sometimes refer to themselves as agender, pansexual, which is a sexuality, which is someone who is interested in folks, not dependent on their gender specifically, but just interested in folks for who they are. Some of this might be familiar, some of it might not be. We'll kind of go through more identities and kind of give a little bit more of a breakdown about what we're speaking to. But the thing to also remember is that we're also speaking within the context of our American culture. And there's a lot of gender identities and sexual orientations that exist in other cultures and have existed for centuries. And we have information on that. If you have any interest in that, you can absolutely reach out to us. So when we think of normative identities, we're usually speaking about heterosexual cisgender people. Cisgender is a word that's used to describe gender identity, and hetero is used to describe a sexual orientation. So cisgender is when someone grows up and identifies with the birth that they were assigned. So they come out, the doctor yells, "It's a girl," and then that baby then grows up to identify as a girl and to identify as a woman. We call this cisgender or cis, and really the root of cisgender comes from Latin, and where cis really means on the same side of. So if you're going to kind of according to we have a little image on screen. It says, so if someone's talking about being on the cis-Atlantic coast, they're saying they're on the same, or being cis-Atlantic, they're on the side of the Atlantic Ocean. So it's just on the same side of, in chemistry, it's used to describe where atoms are placed in molecules. So if something is cis, it's like it's on the same side of something else you're describing. And then conversely, transgender or trans, the root is describing something across from or away from. So it's saying you identify across from or not with the gender you were assigned at birth. Heterosexual is also straight. And what this really means is just they're sexually attracted to the traditionally opposite sex. So we think, cisgender women grow up and are attracted to sexually and romantically cisgender men, and kind of vice versa for cisgender men grow up and are attracted to cisgender women. And really we want to kind of break away from the idea, however, that there's only these two things you could be, either cisgender, transgender, or either gay or straight. There's a lot of other identities you can be. A few, including bisexual, when you're attracted to to one or to two or more genders. Pansexual, when you're attracted to people of all genders. Asexual, which I mentioned before, which is where you experience a little or no sexual attraction. And queer is kind of an umbrella term a lot of folks choose to identify as, and that's really really kind of an identifier is that you're not straight. You kind of, maybe you don't have the words to describe your sexuality, maybe you don't want to describe your sexuality, or maybe you just kind of want to say like, I am just not straight. And that can really be a very personal identity for a lot of folks. And the thing to remember as well is that queer is also a term that used to be or can still be used derogatory. So really the community itself and certain individuals have self-identified with this term. I use it for myself personally. I'm fine with other people using it for me, but there are individuals out there who do not identify with it. So it really is good to kind of hear how folks describe themselves and mirror that language. So to kind of continue, a lot of the times the idea of biology can come up when we're speaking about gender and sexuality, and a lot of folks will always go to this idea that, well, gender is based on biology, sex is based on biology, so isn't that the norm? Isn't that what we should be paying attention to? And that's not reality. Gender is not binary, and biological sex is also non-binary. And this is a queer biologist named Shaquille McLean. He has a PhD in bio. And he's done a lot of research in his dissertation, and really, I think, summarizes it up very well in these tweets, where he says people who don't conform to the colonial gender binary exist and have always existed, and we will always exist. If you're mad, you can go to therapy and unpack why you need to think of us as less than human for you to feel good about yourself. So, really kind of digging into the kind of toxic nature that does exist around transgender and various gender identities, where, a lot of folks have the rhetoric of, if you're, that being within the LGBTQ community is a disorder and should be fixed or changed, when that's not reality, is completely normal, completely natural. And we need to continue that with that education. There are women with penises, there are men with vaginas, there are people who have ambiguous genitalia, and also genitalia across the spectrum. And these are just the facts of life, and biology does not support transphobia. We, have this idea, and we've structured biology to look a certain way to make it pretty clear cut and clean and, quote unquote easy to work with. But the reality is that it's not that simple, and it has never been that simple. We've just created a situation which we assume that it is that simple. And this is a quote by Alexander Leon. I use it for, I love this quote. I think it's really wonderful, and I think it really summarizes up the queer experience in a nutshell, which is queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we've created to protect ourselves based on the society we've been growing up in. So just to kind of go over this really, really quickly. So sexuality versus gender versus sex. So sex or sex assigned at birth is that phrase that's intentionally used to categorize a person's assigned sex, not their gender identity. It's talking about what the doctor looked at when the baby came out and exclaimed about who they were. Usually assigned sex concerns only three categories: female, intersex, or male. Intersex is that category where of ambiguous genitalia, or if the doctors can't decide that they don't feel like they can categorize this child, that kind of the group includes intersex. And the thing to really remember with that is that there is a spectrum with all aspects of gender, including physical attributes that we associate with gender and sex. That's also a spectrum. Not all parts look the same, and that exists, not within their categories and also on a spectrum. And the thing you want to remember also is that legal documentation usually lists sex, not gender identity. So looking at somebody's legal documentation and seeing an F or M is not necessarily going to tell you who that person is or who they identify Sexual orientation is how a person characterizes their emotional, spiritual, and sexual attraction to others. Gender does not determine someone's sexual orientation and vice versa. Gender identity is a person's internal sense of being man or male, woman, female, both, neither, or something else completely. And gender expression is a way a person acts, dresses, speaks, grooms, or behaves. For example, in masculine, feminine, or androgynous ways. And gender expression does not necessarily correspond to sex assigned at birth or gender identity. Someone's gender expression can be very feminine, and they can identify as someone who's masculine, and that is completely fine. Gender unicorn is a great little tool that's kind of used to break apart all these different ideas, because very traditionally we think of, gender and sex and sexual orientation, gender identity all kind of being one. So if you're born and the doctor assigns you male at birth, you grow up, you will act masculinely, you'll grow up to identify as a man, you'll be straight, and so you'll be attracted to women who had a similar but opposite experience, where they were born, assigned female at birth, grew up to be a woman, identify as a woman, and are feminine. Instead, we're kind of breaking this apart with the gender unicorn. We see gender identity as existing on different spectrums, where all can exist with each other genders, man, male, and boy, or female, woman, and girl. Same with gender expression. You can be feminine and masculine at the same time at different and varying degrees. Sex assigned at birth is categorical, and that's kind of highlighting the fact that we do try to categorize these aspects of ourselves. And then physical attraction and emotional attraction also exist on separate spectrums, because again, the reality is that we can't box these up into boxes. They do exist with each other on separate spectrums and also within each other.
Okay, so what does it mean to be LGBTQ+? What does it mean to be a person in this community? Living as a queer person is shifting what is possible for reality, shifting the bounds of what other people think should exist in our lives and in our worlds. We unapologetically amplify what people are trying to erase. We're here, we're loud, we're not shutting up. There's collective power in taking back that space. This is a very strong quote, just giving us a look into what does it mean still to be LGBTQ. Another quote from Alok. He has a great Instagram if anyone wants to follow him. He posts a lot, just fun things to learn about. Sometimes I wonder what I could have been. Sorry. Sometimes I wonder who I could have been, who we could have been if we had a world that didn't require us to destroy our queer child in order to get here. When I look at a movement that so desperately hungers for recognition from the military, from the state, from the very people who disown us, I remember that we are grieving. When I look at a movement that romanticizes colonialism and calls it progress and equality and love, I remember that we are grieving. There is no right or wrong way to be LGBTQIA+. At the end of the day, every single person, however you identify, has their own gender identity, gender expression, and sexuality. This community faces challenges from everywhere, from society, family, friends, healthcare, employment, government, and community programs. No pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. This really symbolizes the need for going out there and advocating for this community. Again, no pride for some of us without liberation for all of us. That quote is very powerful. Okay, so intersectionality. This is a criminal justice, often heard in the criminal justice world. The intersectionality relates to discrimination law. It was coined by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to shed light on the dynamics within discrimination in laws that were not being appreciated by the courts. Intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorization such as race, class, and gender, regarded as creating, overlapping, and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So you can see, sorry, Beckett, in the slide how all these standpoints in society interconnect, from power and privilege, the cage of oppression, this is titled. It all connects in various ways throughout society. Advocacy, from what the LGBTQ community, as I said, they face many barriers from society, from family. In this slide, it goes into a little bit more. So this community, they face increased isolation, family not being supportive, and your partner not being supportive, manipulation and control. Your partner may out you to your family, to friends, that you were not ready to do so. It's threatening to tell people of a victim being LGBTQ. Drug or alcohol abuse. Oops. More than twice as likely to have used illicit drugs. More than twice as likely to have used illicit drugs than heterosexual, about 39.1% as opposed to 17%. And that statistic came from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. Psychological traumas and conditions, increased rates, especially in transgender adolescents, suicide and self-harm.
And just to pop in really quick, there's the statistic currently is around 41 to 51% of transgender individuals will attempt suicide. So it's a very, very high number. And that has to do with exactly as Jen's been speaking to, is this system that the community is living within. And just something that, just to be clear about is that, the risk is not, the increased risk is not the fact that these individuals are LGBTQ. The risk is society and the unsupportive environment that these folks are living in that leads to increasing suicidal rates and also increasing drug abuse.
So barriers in healthcare. 42% of transgender patients reported have experienced mistreatment by healthcare providers. 8% of all LGBTQ people and 14% of those who have experienced discrimination on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity have avoided or postponed medical care because of the fear of facing discrimination. 23% of respondents did not see a doctor when they needed to because of that fear. 8% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents and 29% of transgender respondents reported that healthcare provider refused to see them because of their sexual orientation. So in this, these next coming sections, Beckett and I will go over different barriers to healthcare, barriers in the legal settings and programs, just different barriers that this community faces. So some of them are outlined here: family choice, which relates to the LGBTQ population. You often have a family, but then you also have a chosen family, those that you closely relate to, not on a biological basis. It's those that you don't have the option of putting on a form, this is your family. So we'll talk about a little about that. And then paperwork, of course, forms or signs around organizations. Higher rates of poverty, refusals of services, HIV, stigma, and other forms of discrimination that this community faces. Barriers in healthcare. So in 2016, one of the healthcare, part of the Affordable Care Act, one of the key things that was regulated in this 2016 Act clarified laws that prohibit sex discrimination in healthcare, which included anti-transgender discrimination. The regulation also clarified important parts of the law related to discrimination based on race, national origin, disability, and more. The regulation made it easier for transgender people to enforce their rights under the health care rights law and get access to health care that they needed. However, in 2019, the Trump administration published a formal proposal to roll back numerous provisions of the 2016 regulation, drastically cutting back its interpretation of the law's protection. The rule would remove all recognition by the Health and Human Services Agency that the law prohibits anti-transgender or anti-LGBTQ basis. And then just in April 2020, the Trump administration moved forward with finalizing the rollback, which for the S will not take any action to help people who have faced anti-transgender discrimination. HHS will not investigate complaints of anti-transgender discrimination for the time being, but transgender people can still file lawsuits themselves, and those lawsuits will continue to move forward in the court. Transgender people can also file complaints with their state civil rights agency. So while this is confusing with the different laws and the current administration rolling back, it's important to remember transgender people and LGBTQ people have rights, and they can still and should seek medical attention if it is needed. And also important to remember, only Congress has the power to repeal any kind of law. So if the Trump administration, they can say what they want, but it's up to Congress.
So barriers and shelters. So a proposed housing and urban development rule would allow for federal, and this is in 2020, would allow for federally funded homeless shelters to judge a person's physical characteristics, such as height or facial hair, in determining whether or not they belong in a women's or men's shelter, according to a copy of the rule's text. While the new rule would bar shelters from excluding people based on their transgender status, it would also allow shelters to ignore a person's gender identity and instead house them in accordance with their assigned sex at birth or their legal sex. In other words, a trans woman can't be turned away from a shelter for being trans, but she can be forced to go to a men's shelter, which, just to kind of give a little background, trans women, and specifically trans women of color, are by far the most discriminated against and have the most violence enacted upon them in the United States. Just the combination of identities and the combination of the multi-levels of transphobia, racism, misogyny enacted upon these folks. Having a trans woman go to a men's shelter is extremely dangerous for her. So ultimately, the rule targets both trans women and cisgender women who might have what we think of as more masculine features, which would force them to go to a men's shelter and put them at risk of harm. The rule's language, according to a leaked text, states that single-sex shelter staffs may, quote, determine an individual's sex based on a good faith belief that an individual seeking access to the temporary emergency services is not of the sex as defined in the single-sex facilities policy, which the facility accommodates. So basically, it's saying that you can judge that a staffer can look at somebody and, based on what they believe, tell them that they have to go to a different shelter based on what they're viewing from the person. In order to do this, the Housing and Urban Development would allow shelter staff to take into account, quote, factors such as height, the presence but not absence of facial hair, the presence of an Adam's apple, and other physical characteristics which, considered together, are indicative of a person's biological sex. I hope this goes without saying, this is an extremely violent and pretty horrific thing to do, to have staffers who are in a shelter to protect folks look at somebody and judge them based on a variety of characteristics, which a huge variety of people do have. Facial hair is not something that only cis men have. There's a huge variety of different people who have different levels of facial hair, who are tall, who have different muscle mass, who have different facial structures. So this is an extremely like shocking and violent rule that, and a lot of basically power to discriminate is being given to these shelter staff. In essence, the proposed rule encourages women-only shelter staff to use a visual appraisal of a woman's appearance to judge whether or not that person is quote unquote woman enough to use the facility. So the LGBTQ community and COVID. So COVID-19 is exacerbating previous inequalities in the LGBTQI community, which we already face. So the dynamics of COVID and its economic ramifications are shaped by our existing social context. LGBTQIA people have unequal rights to employment and to housing and even to healthcare. And so they are being, these folks are being hit, just as other different minority groups are as well. And so the whole US population experiences an increased risk of losing jobs, losing homes, and facing food insecurity. That risk is elevated again for LGBTQIA folks. And then, within that breath, even more so than with LGBTQIA folks of color. The Trump administration has rolled back several policies protecting transgender people from discrimination in healthcare and in homeless shelters, which many more people are likely to need in the wake of COVID-19. LGBTQIA people also face rejection from their families and have less of a support network on which they can rely in times of health or financial crises. This is pretty catastrophic for folks. I really do hope it kind of, does go without saying that. COVID-19 and the social distancing issues and, the community itself really is not able to access a lot of the support they need. And, this is kind of going wide for, all communities. So really just kind of taking into consideration, people who are already at risk will already have a huge lack of access to care, be it like specific care that they need. So, LGBTQIA competent doctors and shelter workers and social services, they're even more at risk because they might not have access to folks who might have been safe for them. So the LGBTQ community in CVSS, we were able to get some numbers from CVSS and Family Services to kind of, and what we did here is basically just kind of see like, what's the population of LGBTQI folks at CVSS is seeing, how does that relate to what we can assume to be the population of folks within Dutchess County. So the number of individuals that CVSS served, 2019 is 2,783. Go CVSF, that's awesome. Which is approximately 8% of the Poughkeepsie population. That was my bad. I should have looked at the Dutchess County population, but Poughkeepsie, approximately 8% of the Poughkeepsie population. So from this 2,783, there were 86 self-identifying LGBTQIA clients. And so the percentage of that is approximately 3.1% of the folks served by CVSS were LGBTQIA identifying. So going to kind of zoom out a little bit. In the United States, the LGBTQI population is reported as 4.5. We can assume that this is a gross misunderestimate just because not everybody's out, not everybody feels safe identifying, not everybody really wants to go and be counted as a number for this community, and that's completely fine, respectable. In New York State, the LGBTQIA population is 5.1%. And so the average of that is 4.8%. And so the Dutchess County population is a little under 300,000. And so we can assume that the population in Dutchess County for queer folks is just over 14,000. And so, which is 4.8. And so basically from all these numbers, basically CVSS is seeing like a pretty high percentage of the folks we can assume to be LGBTQI identifying within the Dutchess County population. And so that's really great. It's also, taking into account and remembering that these numbers are very loose. Like they're really only folks who feel, and there's a lot of folks that might not have access to be able to be counted, or also just might not want to be counted. So this is really just a kind of has nothing to do with whether or not CVSS is doing a phenomenal job, and they are absolutely wonderful. And so this is really just kind of thinking like, okay, like what's our reach? Are we reaching assumed full population? Most likely not. And so just taking into account and thinking like, okay, like what could we do that could change this? What could we do to possibly reach more folks? How can we tighten it up? How can we make our space more welcoming?
So in this current 2019 to 2020 legislative session in New York State, Assembly Bill A5240, which is an expansion of gender-neutral bathrooms, was passed. So this bill will require making all single occupancy bathrooms gender neutral in school districts, charter schools, SUNY and CUNY, and community colleges, restaurants, bars, other types of mercantile establishments, factories, and all state-owned or operated buildings will be required to have gender-neutral bathrooms. Title 10 Title 9 relates to education systems. Title 9 protects all students who experience sexual violence, irrespective of the gender of the survivor or the alleged perpetrator. This includes instances of sexual assault or harassment where the perpetrator or survivor are the same gender. So this law was passed as part of the Education Amendment. The law protects people from discrimination based on sex and education programs, activities that receive federal financial assistance. Title IX, again, protects all students who experience sexual violence, irrespective of their gender. 77% of K through 12 students who were out or perceived to be transgender experienced at least one significant form of discrimination, such as being verbally harassed by peers, disciplined more harshly than cisgender peers, or even being physically or sexually assaulted because others believe they were transgender. Harassment can force LGBTQ students to avoid classes or other activities, stay home from school, or even leave school entirely. In May 2016, at the request of educators and school administrators, the U.S. Department of Ed and Justice issued landmark guidance clarifying the rights of thousands of transgender students under Title IX and the school's obligation to follow them. In 2016, the Trump administration withdrew the guidance, leaving many students, parents, and educators unsure about transgender students' rights in the law. Department of Ed's guidance didn't create new rights for transgender students, rather it clarified the rights under Title IX and existing civil rights laws. Although the 2016 guidance has been withdrawn, law hasn't changed. Transgender students are still protected by Title IX, which ensures that they have the right to equal access to educational opportunities, including access to single-sex spaces and activities consistent with their gender identity. Title VII of the Civil Rights Law, Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars employment discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. Just this past June 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that employers cannot fire or cannot terminate employment merely based on being gay or transgender, which would violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This case came out of actually a skydiving case from 2019, a skydiving instructor who part of his position, tandem skydives with clients and was strapped closely to proximity of the client. The employee would often tell his clients about his identity, and one client made a complaint to the organization, and after that the organization fired him. So he brought this all the way to the Supreme Court, which ruled in his favor that employers cannot fire based on any kind of any discrimination that would violate the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which includes protecting gay, lesbian, and transgender employees. More legal barriers that are faced: recognition of marriage or same-sex relationships or children, the ability to change legal documents to align with gender identity or perceived gender expression. And in particularly in detention centers, being fear of sexual assault, being placed in long-term segregation. Segregation holds people by themselves in isolation for long periods of time. And then how can we as advocates create a safe space? Oops, wait. Sorry, Beckett. Go ahead.
No problem. Go for it. All right. Yeah. So exactly as Jen said, how can we do our work to kind of create these more effective spaces? And like, there's a lot of work that can be done, and there's absolutely much more work that can be done. And we can give a lot of resources for that outside of this presentation. But within this presentation, we're going to hit a couple of important things, which is signs, forms, language we use, and then again we're going to go back to bathrooms, which is kind of inclusive of signs, but really I feel like within bathrooms there really has to kind of be a shift in the nature of how we think of bathrooms, and kind of how we interact with bathrooms and those kind of what we think of as more private spaces. So again, there's many means to creating these inclusive spaces. These are just a few of them. Because office culture and how we think about people and how we think about what normalized identities are in different people also has to change. But so these are just a few ways to kind of create those spaces and overtly make sure that when people walk into a space, they can see something or hear something that makes them go, okay, I'm welcome here, I'm seen here. So language is the first. And I think with language really, we can, speak a lot about, how we use the term man, woman, like those, but I think really kind of one of the first steps is creating a more inclusive language is really identifying with like pronouns and why we speak so much about pronouns. So gender pronouns are the words that refer to or express one's gender identity and how we like to be referred to in the third person. So there used to be this conversation around pronouns where and this is shifting away. Well, that was fantastic and a good start. Now we're shifting towards more of the conversation of, well, everybody has pronouns and they're actually not preferred. Someone's pronouns are somebody's pronouns. And the word preferred can sometimes make it sound like there's other pronouns or there's like another name, but when that's not the case, like, so we really are changing the conversation to just be like someone's pronouns. So again, someone using somebody's pronouns when they ask you are not optional. If you're uncomfortable using someone's pronouns, you don't have the choice to revert to other pronouns. If you're uncomfortable using somebody's pronouns, you really should think about that and kind of do some self-exploration, but also maybe just refer to them by their name, but by no means should you insult somebody or harm somebody, because it is violent to refer to somebody by other pronouns other than the ones that they're asking you to refer to them as. You never push someone for the pronouns if they don't want to share. And some people don't use gender pronouns at all. They might just ask you to refer to their name, and that is completely fine too. How do you ask for somebody's pronouns? Sometimes, because this is sometimes a new concept for a lot of folks, it can feel a little uncomfortable to kind of add another step or something else to say. When you're introducing yourself. So, you can really just kind of say you can ask what pronouns do you use. You can ask if we're in an advocate setting or kind of an office setting, and somebody's seeking services, you can ask what pronouns should I use for you in this space. And that one specifically is asking like, maybe because this might be a safe space and there might be spaces that are not safe that you should be using another pronoun. So that is the only case in which you might be using different pronouns for somebody. Again, though, that is coming from that individual. That is not coming from the person determining what pronouns they want to use for somebody. The best way to ask somebody's pronouns, I think, is always to introduce yourself in your own pronouns and then ask for someone's pronouns. If you're just asking for somebody's pronouns off the bat, that's completely fine, but it makes it more normalized and doesn't make it seem like you're asking them because you don't know or you're not sure how to refer to them. By introducing yourself in your own pronouns, it's just normalizing it as if you would ask somebody what their name is. So, hi, my name's Beckett. My pronouns are he and him. What's yours? Simple as that. If you aren't sure of someone's name or pronouns, but you've already asked them or met them, it's absolutely okay to ask them again, because asking again and just having a refresher, just like you might have to ask somebody's name again, is much better than assuming someone's pronouns or their name. And specifically with pronouns, we tend to fall into categorical pronouns based on what we're perceiving about somebody, which again, we have to just highlight that's not the case for everybody. You don't know somebody's pronouns and what they're going to use based off of how you see them or what you think how they're appearing to you. Asking for pronouns totally can feel awkward at first because it is this new, this new kind of social experience that we are asking people to do. But it really is important to avoid misgendering people, and it absolutely will become less awkward. It does not become less painful to be misgendered or different pronoun use for you. At least I'll speak personally, it does not become less painful. It becomes less awkward to ask for pronouns, absolutely. And also you're taking that step to create that safe space for somebody. Or also you're taking that step to create a environment in which asking for pronouns is normalized regardless whether or not there's a trans person in the room, and that's extremely important. You can introduce yourself in your own pronouns and then invite somebody else to share their pronouns, because the thing to remember also is that people don't actually have to share their pronouns. It's just creating that environment where that's normalized. It's an idea, asking somebody else's, introducing yourself, and just kind of, as I said before, and asking for somebody else's pronouns is an ideal step to do, and the ideal way to ask for pronouns, because you're taking that active step to create that protected environment for gender variant people, regardless of whether they're in the room or not. And you're giving the person the option to share what's comfortable for them, if any. And you're also granting somebody that space to learn, and maybe if they don't know what pronouns are, then they can ask, well, what is that? Why do you need that? So it's creating a protected environment. You're being active. You're taking into account regardless of whether somebody who's trans is in the room or not, because that shouldn't matter. Everybody should ask people's pronouns regardless of whether or not there's somebody who you think might have a different pronoun in the room. And also it's creating that space where somebody can learn and ask, oh, what is that? I'm not sure what that is. And then you can educate and, bring it forward and spread the education and the love. And something to remember and highlight again is that pronouns are not a preference. They're an important aspect of somebody's identity. So if you're asking somebody's pronouns, that's their pronoun. You should respect those pronouns. It's really good to start the conversation. It's always appropriate to ask for somebody's pronoun, and then of course respect when somebody doesn't want to share their pronouns. If it's a situation, and this is one aspect of when I have a lot of conversations with people about pronouns, people get hung up on it being awkward and them not wanting to think that if you can assume someone's pronouns, it feels very safe to do so, especially when you're not maybe not in the presence of other trans people, so you feel quote unquote safe to not ask somebody's pronouns. But again, you don't actually know whether or not there's a trans person in the room or somebody of trans experience, and you should never assume that. And there might be a situation in which people are offended or asking, why do you not know? Because a lot of times, sometimes where there's a situation in which folks are going around and sharing pronouns, and we'll get to somebody and they'll go, well, she obviously, and it's we have to kind of shift that where it's actually not obvious that someone goes by she. You do have to tell somebody what your pronouns are, because your pronouns are not indicative of anything. Aside from they're your pronouns, and maybe they would allude to what gender you identify as, but really, it's just a respectful way to, know how to refer to somebody. And if somebody is offended by you asking them the pronouns, like that's okay. It's okay for you to not assume somebody's pronouns. It's very okay for that. And it's a good opportunity to have a conversation about why you shouldn't assume somebody's pronouns. It's good to come to terms with your own discomfort around asking pronouns. It's good to sit with that and just kind of, have some internal thought about like, why is this complicated for me? And also, being gentle with yourself that it is something new, but it is also something that we should be moving towards. And asking pronouns first so that conversations are easier later. So up front what somebody's pronouns are, and then you won't have to have conversations later where you're suddenly realize you've been assuming this person's pronouns, making me feel extremely uncomfortable the entire time. A lot of the time also people get very worried about, okay, well, what if I mess up somebody's pronouns? That is going to happen. It's going to happen just as people mess up somebody's names. Messing up somebody's pronouns can feel a little bit more high stakes, and it can be more high stakes. It really just depends on how you react to it. So here are a few situations. You've just been corrected for using somebody's wrong pronouns. You acknowledge it. Oh, I'm so sorry. Apologize for it. Correct it. And you move on. You just accidentally use someone's previous pronouns and you actually call yourself. Good for you. You acknowledge it. That can be internal. You apologize for it. Sorry, he. You correct it in that sentence, and then you move on. You move forward with your conversation. You've just been corrected for assuming somebody's gender. So let's say you refer to somebody as she, and actually they identify as, they actually go by the pronouns they. You acknowledge it. Oh, I'm so sorry, they, and you move on. And that really is the thing that kind of nailed down is that it's just an acknowledgement of, okay, correcting it within that sentence and then moving on and not hanging up on the fact that you've misgendered somebody. Because if you get stuck in that cycle of over apologizing, even though it can feel relieving for you, it actually puts the onus on the person who's just misgendered to let you know it's okay that you've misgendered them, when it's not okay. It is okay in the sense of, like, it's okay to make a mistake. It's not okay in that it should not be a recurring mistake. And it's not okay where you shouldn't actually be seeking comfort out of the person that you misgendered to make you feel better about misgendering them. How to feel better about misgendering somebody is to acknowledge it and and try to do better next time, and try to remember their pronouns and try to remember what they've asked you to call them. So if you get stuck in that over apologizing cycle, it actually makes the situation worse, because you're asking the person that was harmed to start making you feel better about it, when really all that has to be done is just the acknowledgement of the mistake and then doing better next time.
Guidelines for signages and forms. Signages and forms, it's just about making everyone feel comfortable, showing that we're supportive. It feels good when you walk into an organization and you can identify with something that they, with a cause that they support, or you see a sign that welcomes you. So it's about making everyone feel welcome. So on forms, this is just some suggestions that we had thought of. Clients should be asked about how they self-identify as to their sexual orientation and gender identity on intake forms. Questions should be included in the demographic part of the form alongside questions about race, sex, and date of birth. Clients should also be assured that this information will be kept confidential, and it allows providers to provide them with the most relevant information. Fenway Healthcare is a hospital organization up in Boston, Massachusetts. They recently evaluated how patients reacted to sexual orientation questions on registration forms. 2 sets of questions which were widely used to ask about sexual orientation were reviewed with their clients, and some language that they identified as being good ways to phrase this on forms would be, do you think of yourself as, and then provide examples, lesbian, gay, or homosexual, straight or heterosexual, bisexual or pansexual, something else, and allowing the client to fill in what they feel comfortable with putting in there, and unsure or questioning. Again, these are just guidelines or suggestions for an organization to use. Guidelines for signage. If your office serves the LGBTQIA population or any vulnerable population, there absolutely should be signs addressing these marginalized identities and literature available in the waiting rooms or spaces. Or office spaces. Again, I think it feels good when you walk into an organization and you can see that they support all groups of people. How to make a welcoming environment by using those signs. Participating in provider referral programs through LGBTQ organizations, or advertising your practice in LGBTQ media can create a welcoming environment even before a patient enters the door. Post the rainbow flag, pink triangle, unisex bathroom signs, LGBTQ stickers. These are all just easy things that you can put up in your organization, or on folders that you carry around with you, just to show that you support groups. Exhibit posters, show racially and ethnically diverse same-sex couples or transgender people. Disseminate or visibly post a non-discrimination statement stating that equal care will be provided to all patients regardless of age, race, ethnicity, physical ability or attributes, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Guidelines for signage. Again, bathrooms are a point of contention among those who are not supportive of inclusive restrooms. I think one of the major argument. If you identify as male, they would want to use a female bathroom for the wrong reasons. I think we can move past that argument. If you see someone doing something inappropriate, report them. I think we should leave it up to everyone to choose which restroom they would want to use, regardless of your biases against someone. If you see something, report it. I think that's the most that we can do. Everyone has the right to use a restroom which aligns with their gender identity, and that is no one's place to judge. If someone complains about someone being in the restroom, remind them that this individual knows which bathroom they belong in. Red flag any behavior of anyone in a restroom. Red flag behavior of anyone in a restroom involved in loitering, unsolicited comments, or invasion of personal space or privacy. Gender neutral can sometimes portray a restroom that is only for transgender or gender neutral people, which is something to consider. In order to create a normalcy around gender inclusion, restrooms also should consider gender inclusive or all gender restrooms, both of which emphasize inclusivity. So we do have some examples of just possible signs that could be placed for a bathroom.
And just to pop in really quick, when I worked at a college, like we thought about like gender neutral restroom, really people assumed that gender neutral meant you had to be of a neutral gender to enter. And so usually you can kind of see that the one all the way on the right, the gender neutral, has a little note underneath it that says, this gender neutral restroom is multiple stops and is open to anybody of all gender expressions or identities. And those little ton of tidbits are great because they they can educate somebody to know, like, oh, okay, this is what this is. And also just gives a little bit more information about what exactly is happening in the bathroom.
So just a few more guidelines for something that you could, look at your forms and maybe just make some easy changes to them. Intake forms should use the term relationship status instead of marital status, including options like partner. When asking on the form or verbally about a patient's signature or significant other, use terms such as partner in addition to spouse and or husband, wife. Be aware of any additional barriers caused by differences in socioeconomic status, cultural norms, racial, ethnic discrimination, age, physical ability, and geography. Do not make assumptions about literacy, language capacity, and comfort with direct communication care. When talking about sexual or relationship partners, use gender-neutral language, such as partners or significant others. Ask open-ended questions and avoid making assumptions about the gender of a client or patient's partner or sexual behavior. Use the same language that a patient does to describe their self, sexual partners, relationships, and identity. Guidelines for forms. Pay attention again to the language used on the intake forms or any forms that you're gathering personal information. On all documents, this should not be specified for LGBTQIA folks. I think this is about making it normal for everyone. If we put on there a section specific to this one population of people, it's not normal. It makes it like awkward for people to look at that, and it's not inclusive. It's just don't specify specifically to that population. For name, use legal name to ask what name is on folks' legal documents. Do not use preferred or nickname to ask if someone has another name they go by. On the form, it's recommended to ask that question fully. Is there another name that you go by or would like us to use? Gender, leave an open space for someone to fill in on their own. Someone's assigned sex is irrelevant unless they themselves make it relevant. Pronouns, leave an open space or give some options, including a space to fill in on the form for that. Oops, my screen. Pronouns, the way in which you would like referred, he, she, they, etc. Yay.
And that's it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, yeah, and that's it. So really, you know, this was, you know, very much about just like the idea of like really normalizing and creating that inclusive environment. We were speaking directly about the, you know, the LGBTQI population, but really the recommendations that we have at the end are recommendations for the office space at large, not necessarily like for when you know you have an LGBTQ client, this is how to talk to them. You know, really the idea of creating these protective environments and these inclusive spaces are making all of this normal. So having everybody fill out their gender identity, having everybody fill out their pronouns they use, having all that inclusive language, you know, everywhere. So it becomes normal, and it doesn't work then, because sometimes what can happen is that people can use this inclusive language only when there's LGBTQ folks, which then singles them out and doesn't create that normalized environment, which is exactly what Jenna was referring to. So if you have any questions about this at all, please email us. I only have this email until Friday because I am moving on from this position. I'm going to probably send out an email though, and my email at large will be available. I'm sure in some way or another, I'll definitely give it to Jenna. So if people have any questions. And also I think that pretty easily we can probably make, I actually was thinking about this, but I think I'll just say it here also, creating like a quick like document just kind of with these suggestions, just to be like put on the shared drive so people have access to it, just for some suggestions. So if you have any questions about like specific forms that you have, or you know, specific instances or anything like that, like please feel free to reach out and absolutely refer to any of the information we had on the slides, any of the suggestions we have on the slides, and also, you know, us as individuals. So thank you.
Thank you.